This conversation between Dave Smith and Coleman Hughes is apparently really, really good. So I'm going to go over in real time the Israel-Palestine section of it. There's some interesting topics I can see in the captions on the timeline. But before we talk about that, I was totally wrong about the Hamas ceasefire. They accepted to give the hostages back. Apparently, they have less self-preservation than I previously thought, because once the hostages go back, they're most likely done if they end up doing that. This is a good thing for Palestinians, for the hostages, of course, because now that there's no hostages, Israel has less cover. Their veil is getting thinner for why they should continue bombing the Gaza Strip. So good for probably Palestinian, quality of life. But let's get into this. I think they're starting off with, is Israel a peace-seeking state or an expansionist state? It's kind of a stupid binary, but there's a lot of detail there. Let's get into it.
I believe I've heard you make the argument that Israel's foreign policy is motivated at a deep level by this greater Israel ambition and not by fundamentally a desire for peace. And I think this is a deep disagreement between us. So give me your view on whether Israel's main motivation is peace or, put it in your own words.
I'll give my answer first. Only in the West Bank, right? If you look at the whole history, the idea that Greater Israel was going to expand into like the Sinai, Lebanon, Syria, I think that's without evidence, right? Even in the West Bank in 1967, they offered Lebanon an off-ramp and not get into the war. They wouldn't have occupied the West Bank, but Jordan gave them a chance. Jordan attacked, they occupied it, and now 60 years later or so, they have set up civil land registry. So that process has finished. They have de facto annexed the land, but they did not necessarily seek it aggressively. They sought it defensively at first, and then when the opportunity arose to take back Judea and Samaria, the politics of Israel ended up falling into place. But that logic does not seem to work for Gaza or Lebanon or Syria. They don't care as much about those areas necessarily. Maybe the Golan Heights, but they would be willing to give that back much sooner than like East Jerusalem or like any of the West Bank settlements right now.
I mean, again, I think that it's always a little bit problematic when we say this, like Israel's main motivation, because again, it's like there's different people and there's different factions, and I really am an individualist at my core, and like there is no will of the Israelis, and in fact, for at least for a period of time, the will of the Israelis, if there is such a thing, was for a two-state solution, I think, at least but up until the Second Intifada. I think that, look, I mean, Netanyahu said something about the Greater Israel project being very close and near and dear to his heart or something like that. I think that essentially my view of it is that
his
Netanyahu has had to...
his best point of evidence would be probably the Likud party charter, which says there should only be Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. And obviously the early Zionists, some of them were more extreme. They wrote about Greater Israel. It's taken a different form in modern day, just like Putin's like Novorossiya has taken a different form than it has in the past, right? It's about settlements now. It's not necessarily about finding a home for the Jews. It's about this specific land, right? Not necessarily expanding into like the East Bank, right?
Coalition with hard right-wing Israeli politicians, for a couple clicks to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a right-winger himself. I think many of them are openly motivated by the greater idea of Greater Israel, and that the idea that the land was given to them by God, and when you really fundamentally believe that from a religious perspective, as many religious Jews do, that's really tough to argue with. That once the land was given to you by God, well, then whatever we got to do in order to get it is kind of justified because it was God's will. So I think that is. There's a portion of Israel who are motivated by that. I've always thought that the center of Netanyahu's motivation, of his life's ambition, his career, has been to thwart a Palestinian state.
Looking to transport a vehicle? Montway will help quickly, safely, and easily in 3 simple steps.
Now,
Yeah, and nowadays he's more confident in saying it, but even in like 2019 Likud party factions, he's quoted as, saying that, we should let in funds for Hamas because we should let Gazans work so they can come back and be taxed by Hamas, so that there is a bigger divide between, a reasonable body like the PA and an unreasonable body like Hamas, right? That was his logic, and he's more open about it nowadays. He completely lies about wanting to prop up Hamas, but multiple sources say that was his policy, and it looks like that was his policy by how much cash he let in. But that's the reality, and Benjamin Netanyahu's not even the most right wing faction. There's like 2 factions to the right of him, right? Ben Gvir's and Smotrich's.
I mean, I think he's pretty open about that. It's not like I'm reading minds or something here, but I think that, why exactly I don't know enough. I'm not an Israeli, and even as an American, it's hard to tell what are the true motivations of some of our politicians are. I don't know exactly why, is that because he thinks that's what's best for Israel long term? Is that because he thinks that greater Israel will ultimately be achieved through the process of building settlements in the West Bank and things like that? I don't know, but it certainly seems to be the thwarting of a Palestinian state driving a lot of his ideology.
So I would say a few things, points of agreement. I agree that Israel wanted a 2-state solution up until the Second Intifada changed everything. And I'm happy to hear you agree with that. I think that, as you say...
The populace. This is very important because Yitzhak Rabin got assassinated, and then Benjamin Netanyahu went to office, and he lifted the kind of freeze-ish that Rabin had on settlements, because in Oslo 2, they said, in Oslo 1, before that, that the status of the settlement should not be changed. And Benjamin Netanyahu, elected in 1996, did the complete opposite of that, right? He thwarted the peace process, partly by, expanding settlements in such a violent, drastic way. These were multiple times over expansions. And we still see that kind of pattern there today. I say with Rabin, he's correct. And with the Israeli populace, he's also correct. Peace sentiment at the time was very high. It was higher among Palestinians. It's always been higher among Palestinians. If you seclude it to the 1967 borders, we can talk about what the status of that polling is today later. But I don't know why Dave is conceding that whole decade of time where Benjamin Netanyahu was, he had his influence, and there was a right-wing shift. I don't know what happened to it. Like, maybe the first Intifada had some, carryover. Maybe the assassination of Rabin, but I just don't know what caused that at a deep level. It's easy to say the second Intifada, but it was earlier than that.
It's a democracy. It has factions like we do. Netanyahu is the mainstream right-wing faction, and when he won the prime minister's office the most recent time, the centrist parties refused to go into coalition with him. This is what forced him to partner with the crazies, with the Ben Gvir and with the Smotrich. And this is absolutely a tragedy for Israeli politics, for Palestinians, for the region. And I think it's many people were critical of the centrist party not partnering with him at the time. I think in retrospect, it is not talked about enough how bad a calculation was that was for everyone involved. However, you can sort of judge a democracy by the output of its policies put into context. So not only did Israel offer a 2-state solution, land for peace in 2000, the whole way that they came under possession of the West Bank in the Six-Day War was in the context of a defensive war, not a war of expansion. They left Gaza in 2000.
I hesitate to call it either a defensive war or a war of expansion. If anyone's telling to you that the 1967 war was either initiated by Egypt or initiated by Israel, then they don't know what the 1967 war is. There's so many details there that people just don't even mention. Hopefully they talk about it more here. But the land for peace, this is something that Gideon Levy talks about a lot. It's not about the land. Palestinians are fairly lenient with water sovereignty. They'll have an international force on the Jordanian border. They're fine with that. They want some kind of recognition that in 1947, 700,000 of them were displaced. Whether that be through a limited right of return, but a recognition of a broader suffering caused by the state of Israel, or resettlement within just Gaza and the West Bank, right? We know from polling that two-thirds of Gazans would be okay just resettling within Gaza and the West Bank, and only 10 to 20% of Palestinians in total would actually want to return to Israel. People say Palestinians are so anti-Semitic. Like, you should want them to be anti-Semitic, because if they're more anti-Semitic, that makes peace easier because it makes them less likely to want to return to Israel proper, right? Because they don't want to live with the Jews. So they say, right?
And you add these things up, and you get a picture of what is the actual output of Israeli policies, taking as a rounding error the obvious factional differences within the society. And it's clear to me, whenever the choice has been between greater Israel ambitions and peace, such as in negotiations with Egypt, where they give back the Sinai, they're at war with Egypt for decades and decades and decades. They give back the Sinai in exchange for peace because peace is more important to most Israelis.
The Sinai is in the West Bank, and there was very much different politics there. And you had a Sadat-like figure who was willing to negotiate that, right? Sadat, even before Yom Kippur, he was sending out peace overtures. He wanted peace. He didn't like the Arab League as much as his predecessor Nasser did, right? He was okay with breaking from them, and that's what happened, right? That's why peace happened. You need a Sadat-like figure. And the Palestinians, through an unfortunate series of events, don't have that figure. They have Hamas. Much more incompetent. The structure of how things have gone in Palestinian society has made it so they do not have their peace leader. Don't know why that is necessarily. Well, I can make my best guesses. Maybe it's because they live in a situation where they're constantly under threat of their occupier, or they constantly feel the pressure of the occupation and cause them to do crazy stuff like October 7th. But
Israeli society swings to the right when people become convinced, as a result of Palestinian intransigence, Palestinian terror, that the leadership is not actually currently capable of making a peace deal, and therefore we might as well just batten down the hatches. So that's my basic view.
Okay, so I disagree with a lot there. I don't disagree with all of it. I mean, I think it's like kind of the most charitable interpretation you could possibly give the Israelis, and there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And I also think there's a lot, getting into the details of the negotiations, I don't think it's exactly right that they offered the Palestinians a state. I would say, okay, so look, let's start with Camp David. Number one, not Camp David 2000, Camp David in the 70s. You're talking about the deal with the Egyptians, right? Like, the other way to look at that, though, which is true, right? And I give...
Fiverr allows us to take our dreams and make it a reality.
We're able to hire freelance illustrators and
look, I don't like, essentially what came out of that agreement was that we would forever give foreign aid to Israel and Egypt. That was a big part of making the agreement.
Yeah, kind of. That is what's tying Egypt's, like, when people say, oh, there isn't a blockade on Gaza, there's a blockade on Gaza that depends on Egypt and Israel, so why do you only complain about Israel? It's like, if Israel stopped doing the blockade and started funneling Hamas people into there, which would be what would happen, they would lose all their aid, essentially. That's what would happen. Not that giving aid to Egypt is a bad thing, or Israel is a bad thing. Israel is in an important spot in the world, no matter what position you take on it. So having them as an ally is good, so long as they do good things with the money. And right now they're doing the opposite of good things.
And I'm not the biggest fan of foreign aid, but I kind of give everybody involved some credit for this. But the other way to look at it, from the way you're saying, right, is number one, you could say, if you want to just be charitable to the Israelis, you say what you said. hey, look, they had the opportunity to give up land for peace. They were happy to do that. But the flip side to that is that they got peace for it. They gave up the land and they got peace. They went to war with Egypt, what was it, 4 times in 25 years? And they haven't been to war with them since then. It's been quite a while. We're going on, 50 years. So that's the flip side to it.
It also took the Yom Kippur War, which made Israel realize it's not invincible, and it also made Sadat realize that if we didn't win then, we're not going to win any time, right? It was very costly to Israel because they were truly caught off guard, and Egypt had everything stacked in their favor. They couldn't pull it off. So both states were like, peace is in our best interest now. The power dynamics are very much shifted. Peace is not in the interest of the Israelis. They love their settlements. They're not going to pull out hundreds of thousands of people from those settlements for a peace with a relatively non-threatening, demilitarized people, who aren't allowed to have guns like in the West Bank. Any Palestinians in Area C can't have guns. The settlers can. It's fairly under wraps as far as the Israelis concern it. Egypt is a sovereign nation that can funnel in weapons from their Arab allies and launch a whole other Yom Kippur war. So different there.
In terms of the negotiations, look, even Shlomo Ben-Ami said that he would have turned down the Camp David deal too. So I think
he said he would have turned down Camp David and accepted the Clinton parameters. That was the second half of the sentence.
Fair enough. But I'm just saying, when everyone says the Camp David deal was such a great offer, I'm just saying that even the foreign minister or the acting foreign minister at the time of Israel has a different view of it.
And then they made a better offer, and the same guy said it was a tragedy they didn't take this second offer.
Yes. No, I agree. But again,
that's important context. If you're going to quote Ben-Ami,
it is important context. But I agree. It's a fair point. But at the same time, there is something in a court of law.
The Clinton parameters were pretty good. Omer was still a lot better. What was offered in the Taba Summit wasn't as good as the international sovereignty over the old city, etc. That was probably and the even land swaps. Clinton parameters still fell short when it came to you guessed it, right of return. The fact that Israel still won't recognize that they have created a refugee crisis that they refuse to solve, or refuse to even acknowledge. It's like the Turkish not acknowledging the Armenian genocide. This stuff is well documented. Zionists document it. Benny Morris has several good resources on it. I suggest you read it. We know exactly how many towns were leveled in 1948. How many evacuation orders the Israelis or the Haganah gave to the Arab villages, and we can compare that to the amount of evacuation orders that Arabs gave to Arab villages, and it is clear as day what was going on there. It was Israelis doing a joint defense and expansion operation with a legitimate defense kind of veil, but at the end of the day, it ended up being expansionist, and they were fine with that.
If the guy who's on trial denied committing the murder 10 times and then he confessed, the one confession means a lot more than the 10 denials. And so the point is that even the foreign minister, who you would expect to be saying, taking the pro-Israel side on this, even he admitted that one of the deals that is flouted, you have to admit, is constantly talked about in the context of this debate as being this amazing offer that Israel gave to the Palestinians. He said he would have turned it down. That's a pretty interesting piece of information, and much more interesting than him saying, but the other deal was really fair. Of course, we also have Netanyahu referring to Hebron now, not, but
well, hold on. If you're going to say Shlomo Ben-Ami had his head screwed on straight among Israeli voices, then you also have to put a lot of weight on him saying, we made them a much better offer in the Clinton parameters, and they were crazy to say no.
No,
he's either,
you don't. You don't have to say that, therefore, because...
So he has his head screwed on straight when he's saying Camp David was a bad offer.
No, it's not about
suddenly he's not credible.
No, it's not. It's not about being credible or not credible or his head being screwed on differently. It's a more interesting and relevant detail when the acting foreign minister at the time admits that this wasn't a great deal than him saying, and at this point, I think we did do the right thing and offer a good deal here. That's
and they said no. And they still said no.
Yeah. Oh, look, and by the way, I'm not taking the position that the Arabs shouldn't have taken that deal. I mean, like,
Yeah, it was a pretty good deal. East Jerusalem was settled much better with Omer. The land swaps were better with Omer, but it was a pretty good deal. But the Palestinians still want that kind of they would accept that deal today, is what I'm saying. But it is missing a core component, which is right of return, which isn't that radical if you think about it. It's just not. And if a Palestinian leader were to accept a deal that did not have right of return in it, then they would probably be killed within the next month. There's a history of this, right? It's happened on the Israeli side too. Look at Yitzhak Rabin.
I think perhaps we'd be living in a much better world if they had. There's been many mistakes made on both sides of this, including embracing violence.
Ben Ami said the effort to get Arafat to accept the Clinton parameters was probably the greatest effort of diplomatic pressure the world has ever seen on a leader of any people. I'm almost quoting him directly.
Sure. Okay. I think there's a real problem that you have here going down, even like leaving aside the negotiations. I mean, we could talk more about it if you want to, but leaving aside that, I was going to make the point that we have Benjamin Netanyahu on tape bragging about the poison pill. He doesn't know he's on tape, but he's bragging about the poison pills that he was able to put in the negotiation process. And so it's a lot more complicated than this, but I think this is the real problem you have when you zoom out.
Can I respond to the poison pill thing?
Sure.
I agree with you that the poison pill thing is terrible, but how did Israeli society react? They got Benjamin Netanyahu out of office because they're a democracy, and they voted in Ehud Barak. Partly, one of the many reasons people were unsatisfied with Netanyahu is because he was not taking the negotiations seriously. And
That is very true, and it's why Netanyahu's term was so short there. He comes back like longest serving prime minister, but to their credit, these 70% appetites for peace, which was very, very prevalent in the 1990s, did put a more reasonable person in office with Ehud Barak, who was able to offer something a little bit better, missing right of return, right? They should have, just to be very clear, the Arabs should have accepted most of those deals, especially Top of Summit and Omer.
Goes to show when the Israelis feel like there is a chance for peace, society tends to swing to the left in a democracy.
Okay, perhaps that's an interesting theory. I'll give the Israelis credit for voting Netanyahu out that one time, but then they got to take the blame for him being their longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. I think that also, I just one other point of detail. I mean, I don't know the 67 war or the 6-day war. Calling it a defensive war is a little bit debatable, but regardless of that,
I don't think it is. I think it's an open and shut case.
All right. I mean, even though he defended the war, Menachem Begin himself called it a war of choice, and it was a preemptive strike on Egypt that kicked the whole thing off. They had amassed some troops, and
Yitzhak Rabin, he's on the top of my head right now. He actually said that the troops that Nasser sent into the Sinai to militarize the Sinai the numbers of them were way too small to pose any kind of military threat to Israel. Now that's just another point. Not to say that Israel wasn't threatened. They were threatened from Egypt crossing the red line of closing the Straits of Tiran. That was so many legs too far for Nasser to do that. He knew he was going to provoke a war by doing it because that had been Israel's red line forever because 90% of their oil goes through that. So closing the Straits of Tiran was basically a declaration of war. Israel didn't have to do it, but they made it very clear that they had a reasonable red line. Now, some red lines are unreasonable, and you cannot respect them. Like Putin's red line of NATO has to dissolve and shrink back to 1997 levels. It's like, that's a red line that is so stupid we shouldn't even see it as a red line that we should bother not crossing, right? Because Putin obviously doesn't care if we cross it or not. He was probably going to do whatever he wants anyways. Same cannot be said for Nasser. For Israel. This was a reasonable red line. 90% of the oil shipping through this thing. Their only access to Red Sea, the port of Eilat, right? Totally reasonable thing to ask for. And reasonable thing that you should let your neighbor do, right? shipping along the Sinai. That's not too it's not too controversial. Maybe it is for some people, but allowing people to have access to the sea that their coast connects to, it's like, I think that's pretty it's not too controversial there.
Certainly, there were provocations on the Israeli side, on the Egyptian side. So, but regardless, they weren't attacked by Palestinians. When they fought a war with Egyptians and Jordanians, and then they took control at the end of this of a territory that had millions of people living in it. And I think the major problem you got, Coleman, and I think this is a big part of the reason why, just like broadly speaking, Israel is losing this debate so badly right now in the eye of the public. And I think one of the major problems here is that, like, if you just look, even saying we offered, let's say they offered them their 100% statehood 5 times, which is not true, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that were true. So,
yeah, it doesn't really justify the deaths, right? Dave Smith is coming from I think he's like perfect on Israel, but he's very stupid on everything else. That doesn't justify the current military operation, which is what's relevant. I think in a moderate society, I would maybe be considered like a moderate Zionist, because I think that Israel has some defensive claim to existence in the context of the Holocaust in that very specific narrow window. But they've just become so indefensible, right? And I'll defend them through history. I think they might have been in the right. They were probably in the right, for most of the history. Besides the early part, right now, some parts in the 2010s, the Netanyahu prime ministership, I'll say about half the time they might have been in the right, and the Israeli public might have been in the right. But right now, they're deeply in the wrong.
like, it's on the level of just being
so
like,
what?
because
the only way the conflict will end is when there's a partition.
Well, I was about to. I obviously wasn't done with the sentence, so I'm obviously about to say the so what. Yeah, dude. If you had an institution of slavery or something like that, and you go, well, we offered them their freedom 5 times and they didn't take it. It's like, who cares? Stop enslaving them. That has nothing to do with anything. It's like, look, dude, you don't need a partner to just stop the occupation. Statehood. Nobody in the Enlightenment world views statehood as a gift.
That's a little bit stupid. Typically, if you're going to make a peace deal, you need some security guarantees. Israel just doesn't pull out and say, hey, we're being super nice now, we're giving you all the state stuff. The Palestinians would still be like, where's my right of return? We're going to militarize now that you pull it out, and possibly do October 7th again, because you haven't truly made peace in this conflict. You've done a cop-out, like a Gaza pullout, right? You haven't made up for. I mean, I get what he's saying. It would be better than nothing. It would actually be really good if all the settlers got pulled out. And it might even solve the conflict. But it's not in the best interest of both sides, because they don't get the chance to negotiate, better security or possible right of return retribution for past atrocities.
Chosen from one people to give to another people. I mean, what is going on here? Does Israel have a right to the West Bank and to Gaza? Is that theirs? If it's theirs, the millions of people who live there do not have citizenship or voting rights or any natural rights under Israeli law. So if that is Israel, then they're not a democracy. They're an apartheid regime. And if it's not Israel, well, then what right do they have to be the ones who decide whether these people get a state or not? This is like, I just don't find any other example where any modern nation acts this way, and this is acceptable.
What you're recommending is what Israel did with Gaza in 2005. They left unilaterally without getting a peace deal in return.
Okay, so let's get into the withdrawal from.
Again, Gaza is not the West Bank. The West Bank is infinitely more important than any other piece of land in this conflict. Judea and Samaria, right? It's just more religiously connected to their society for whatever reason. I mean, we know the reason, but it's just not the same. The Gaza occupation the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Keeping it alive amid the volatility for such a small, stupid piece of land, it's like not worth it. It's so small. They want to get out. I think in part because of an appetite for peace, but also in part because they wanted to, say they were giving a concession that wasn't really a concession. It was a very small, very, very small thing that they did. So I would not compare anything that's not the West Bank to the West Bank, where, the settlership there is going to be in the millions soon, right? That's so much more significant.
Gaza. I mean, like, as you know, right? Like, Sharon's top advisor, the formaldehyde. I'm sorry, what's his name again?
Dove Weissglass?
Dove Weissglass. Go read Dove Weissglass's quote on what the whole deal was there.
I'll read it to you right now, Dave.
Okay.
I'll read it to you because I've heard you quote this before. And actually, I had Youssef Menayer, a Palestinian activist, on my podcast. And he said what I think you're about to say, which is that Dove Weissglass, in a Haaretz interview in 2004, said the point of the Gaza withdrawal was to put the peace process in formaldehyde.
Yeah, and he said everything that the entire Palestinian state. No, I'm just adding to the quote. This was what he said, but sure, go ahead.
Okay, so let's add more to the quote, because I have never seen someone on your side of this argument quote the full context of his interview honestly and in full context. So this is what he said just before.
I actually don't know the full quote either, so that's my fault. I mean, maybe it's interesting.
The idea of putting the peace process in formaldehyde. This is him. He goes, when we entered the prime minister's office, he means 2002, Sharon still believed he would be able to achieve a very long-term interim agreement, an agreement of 25 or 20 or 15 or 10 or 5 years, a truce. But very quickly, we discovered that we were up against a stone wall, that when you get to the decision-making center, nothing happens. We reached that conclusion after years of thinking otherwise, after years of attempts at dialogue. But when Arafat undermined Abu Mazen at the end of the summer of 2003, we reached the sad conclusion that there was no one to talk to, no one to negotiate, hence the disengagement plan. So in context, what he is saying is that when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon was elected in 2002, his plan A was to get a 25-year peace truce with the Palestinians. When he realized that they didn't want that, or that Arafat didn't want that. And
that would be the equivalent of a ceasefire. Sharon wasn't going to offer them, a great deal here. I don't know where he's going with this.
Let Abbas go for it. Only then did he pivot to say, okay, our next best option is just to get out of Gaza unilaterally. Now, I think that is very important context if you're going to quote the Dove Weissglass interview in the future, because it speaks to this whole argument we're having is what were Israel's intentions leaving the Gaza Strip? And it's highly relevant that the aide you're quoting said plan A was to get a truce. And the hope is that if you get 25 years of a truce, well, then people get used to not fighting. I'm waxing now. They didn't say this, but my guess is
right. I get your point, but
yes.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know. I don't think that.
Yeah, that context was stupid. I was hoping. Yeah, there's a reason no one knows that context because it doesn't add that much. Of course, you want a truce. A truce doesn't involve giving up anything that's hard to give up. What is truly hard to give up is a slightly greater Jewish majority in Israel if you're going to do right of return, or hundreds of thousands of people who have to leave the West Bank. That is really hard to give up. Not attacking your enemy, that is not hard to give up. So that as your plan A, and your enemy won't. In all fairness, your enemy won't agree to a truce either. So that is your plan A, and then your plan B is to put the peace process in formaldehyde. Again, this context doesn't save this quote that much.
Being dishonest about leaving.
And then, sorry, if you don't mind, just 30 more seconds, and then say whatever you want. After the Gaza disengagement plan, also a few settlements in the West Bank were also, nobody talks about that, but also taken out. What does Ariel Sharon do?
Settlements in the West Bank are always coming and going, but they're coming. They seem to be building faster than they're going at it every single year. You can't find a year really since Netanyahu where they haven't done that. So, am I taking down like 2 or 3? Just like they do today sometimes with the outposts, but it's irrelevant.
He starts a new party. He starts a new party called Kadima. The platform of Kadima is to eventually withdraw unilaterally from the West Bank. Then he gets a stroke, and his number two, Olmert, runs on the platform of leaving the West Bank, the convergence plan, and he wins. So that also is important context if we're
100%.
judging what Sharon was trying to get at with the Gaza plan.
Well,
Go ahead.
look, yeah, it's important context, and it's also important context that, like that the Israeli people were on board with.
I mean, maybe by formaldehyde or like freeze the peace process, he's like, this is not going anywhere anytime soon, so we're just going to do this and like put our hands up and wait till something happens. Like, I can buy that. But, the disengaging from Gaza wasn't this like massive dovish move. If Israel was really in that mood, they would have disengaged from the West Bank. Why not do that? That is what actually matters. None of this other land even matters at all.
Or at least voted for someone running on that platform. I agree with you. I don't think there's anything dishonest, though, about leaving that out. The point is that we're talking about the disengagement in 2005, and you have the senior advisor for the prime minister overseeing it telling you that what that was about was putting the peace process in formaldehyde, making it impossible for the Palestinian state to ever be achieved, that was their goal. Now, you could say they came up with that as a second best option. Okay, fine. But the point is that so many of the Israel defenders, they describe it as if, in fact, Douglas Murray, when we debated, said that was the Palestinian state. That was a two-state solution. And this is just like, that's what's intensely dishonest, is to leave the...
That's actually a great point. They say we've tried a Palestinian state. Like, the dumbest argument, and I'm glad Coleman Hughes doesn't make this argument, but like, we've tried a Palestinian state and it doesn't work. It's like, this land doesn't matter. How many times can I say it? What matters is what the land that you call Judea and Samaria, and people like Ben Shapiro retweet, David Friedman, one Jewish state, like Hamas levels of extremism, rivers to the sea, there should only be Jewish sovereignty. Like, this is the real problem.
Now, about the settlements, I think I'm pretty sure, I'd have to go back and double check this, but I think the number of settlements in the West Bank drastically increased in the following couple of years after 2005. Again, this
okay,
really...
what I said was that the Gaza disengagement also, there was like 4 West Bank settlements that were added, that were also evacuated at the same time. It's not important. What I want to address myself...
They built up a lot more settlements, though, over the years. On net, there were more settlements in the West Bank, and there's many more settlements in the West Bank than there were back then.
So, the point I'm making is not just it was Plan A and Plan B. It's actually deeper than that. The reason they switched to Plan B is because they came to the belief, based on Arafat's behavior, that Arafat actually did not want the political process to lead to a true peace, right? So if you believe that the peace process would essentially be a gift box with peace on the label, and then the moment you open it up, you get terrorism. If you come to that belief based on the behavior of your negotiating partner, that they intend to take whatever they can get out of the negotiation.
It's because no one can sympathize with his position. If he accepted the Clinton parameters, that would be a great deal for everyday Palestinians a few years down the road. But there's so much pressure on him not to do that because he's leaving out what Palestinians care about the most. That's UN Resolution 194. He could, if there's no principal agreement of that, then no Arab leader, back then at least, is going to accept that. There would be just so much outrage, and it would feel like betrayal from the people who experienced, the events that led to Resolution 194.
And then launch terror. Then thwarting the peace process is not thwarting a peaceful a situation like America and Canada. You're not thwarting a true two-state solution. You believe, based on the behavior of your negotiating partner, that you're thwarting what would essentially be a situation where terrorists take over parts of the West Bank. Oh, this is the other part of the interview that is crucial to this point, is that Sharon came to believe that a Palestinian state would be too weak to control its violent minority, i.e. the Fatah would not be strong enough, would not have the state capacity to prevent Hamas, to prevent it from coming basically another Lebanon, a Lebanon where half the country is controlled by a terrorist group, right? And then you're as a leader of Israel, you're basically telling people, well, if we really come to believe in good faith that this guy is not a partner for peace, and we've got to wait till we get a real partner for peace, giving him two states will essentially mean that we're going to be in a situation where terrorists control strategic high ground, a place from which they can much.
I would disagree that Arafat's whole goal in life was to sabotage the peace process. As I just said, he's coming from a different point. Coleman hasn't talked about any of what was left out of those deals that made them not accept it. Like, it's not just this psychotic denial of peace. It's not about the land. The land was fine. It's about things he's not mentioning. And if you look at the Clinton parameters, when Clinton sent out those parameters, you can look at the Wikipedia page for this. There's the Arafat's response to them. It was outside the parameters, but it was very detailed and in very good faith. Like, it's a good example of Arafat engaging with his negotiation partners and actually wanting to get a result. Actually, I'll pull that up real quick. Sorry, it's not an email. I'm just being stupid. It is a letter, right? As they did back in the day. Arafat responded with some pretty clear clarifications to the proposal. It has to do with, I have specific concerns with Palestinian sovereignty over Al-Haram al-Sharif. I have many questions relating to the return of refugees to their homes and villages. I have a negative experience with the return of displaced Palestinians to West Bank, Gaza in the interim period, etc. I don't see a clear approach dealing with the compensation of refugees for the land, property, and funds taken by Israel under the aegis of Israeli custodian of absentee property. I feel that the period for Israeli withdrawal specified in your initiative is too long, etc. I have many questions. I need maps, details, clarifications. We need a real opportunity to invest once more. I remain, Mr. President, ready to pay you a video at the White House. If saying that Arafat was denied this from the jump, I think is not a good. It's not a good representation of any of this. Is what I'm trying to say. But back to
you in much more jeopardy than you're already in. So this is the trade-off Israel faces.
Yeah, it's like, which I know I've quoted before when talking about this, but it's that old Thomas Jefferson quote about slavery, where he's like, we have the wolf by the ear and can neither afford to hold on to it nor safely let it go. And, it's like, I just, Coleman, they've been occupying them since 1967. Are they concerned about what might happen if they take their boot off their neck? Okay. But they still don't get to do that to people. We got a real problem with black crime in this country, Coleman. But if I said, let's reinstitute slavery and that will take care of the problem with black crime, I think you'd go, yeah, you don't have a right to do that. And if not having slavery means that it's a little bit more dangerous in some areas, tough, deal with that. You don't, Israel, look, dude, this is just so obvious. It's bananas to me that anybody who lives in a first world country on this side of the Enlightenment can just not say, look, Israel's got two options here. Your options, if you want to be a moral country or whatever, your options are, you can say, we can't give them their own state, and so we're just annexing all of this land and giving citizenship to all the Palestinians, and we will all live under one state together, or you can stop occupying them militarily and let them have their own, autonomy. Those are the options. You can't just keep your boot on these people's neck forever because you're worried about what might happen, even if it's a legitimate worry about what might happen if you take your boot off. And the idea that on the other side of this, the Palestinians are just supposed to accept you live in subjugation in perpetuity, forever.
Yeah, and if there's a war of annihilation, once they do get sovereignty, then the whole entire world will be on the side of Israel. Wouldn't that be great? It would be like Russia invading Ukraine, Palestine invading Israel. Everyone would be behind Israel. Israel would have so much aid in 2 days from NATO, and they would be happy. Palestinians would be weak. All of their allies would abandon them. They'd say, you're stupid. We have this Abraham Accords thing. We have so much tied up in Israel. We also get aid from the Americans. You're literally the dumbest people on planet Earth. Why do you do that? Guess what? That's never going to happen. For all the reasons I just went over. All the incentives are not aligned. The Palestinians would not mount an invasion of Israel. Unless they're literally brain dead. I just don't see it happening. And their allies would disappear. They would have none. No ally would support that. Maybe Iran, and Hezbollah, Houthis maybe, but none of the actual Arab countries with real military power that are allied with the West in some adjacent way.
Because some of your leaders made bad decisions, and then you can say like look, you could have made this argument about Egypt. I don't think they had a strong enough state to control their radicals or something like that. Now, we could get into a whole separate argument, which is that I think there's a very strong argument that actually Israel is going to face much more of a terrorist threat while they're occupying these areas than they would if they were to give them their own state. And I think there's lots of good reasons to suspect that. But just purely on a principled ground, this is just totally indefensible. And there's no other country that we would call a democracy who behaves this way. It's like, this is, I don't know. I just find this whole thing to be so goofy. Like, either this is Israel, either you're saying Israel has a legitimate claim to Gaza and the West Bank, or you're saying they do not. And if they do not, then they have to stop occupying them. And if they do, then they have to give citizenship to the people that they control. So it's really fundamental Western civilization stuff.
So the analogy to slavery is a bad one for many reasons. But first, yes, Jefferson and Southerners in general, they feared, partly based on Haiti and other examples, that if they gave slaves freedom, it would result in a race war. And this was highly motivating for Southerners. It turned out to be completely wrong. Now, there was a lot of evidence at the time that this wouldn't happen, namely the fact that you had Black people living very peacefully all over the North with no problem. You even had free Blacks in the South with no problem. And so you would have had to cherry.
You also have peaceful Palestinians with no problem. You have Arab Israelis who cause no problems. What's your point? Yes, there's going to be some murderous psychopaths who do a Nat Turner rebellion, but that's more of a sign of the times than this group, this race, this ethnicity, this religion is permanently to be subjugated and not to be trusted, right? As Dave Smith was just saying.
Massively to look at the Nat Turner revolt, say, erase all the other evidence of peaceful coexistence between whites and blacks and say, we can't let these people have freedom because look at Nat Turner. Not only that, there was no, anytime there was Black leadership, the most famous Black leader, the most important Black leader in the aftermath of the Civil War was Booker T. Washington, right? You can make the same argument about like the Civil Rights Movement, right? We can't give them voting rights because then they're going to make decisions that are going to be terrible. It's going to be a race war. They're going to destroy us. They're going to slaughter us. Every single popular Black leader, Booker T. Washington, utterly peaceful, had the total faith and devotion of the Black community. He was the most beloved figure, and he was fundamentally nonviolent. Martin Luther King, absolutely the most beloved figure within the Black community, much more so than Malcolm X at the time. And even Malcolm X in his most radical mood, never...
He wasn't a terrorist, yeah.
He wasn't.
Well, they kind of had the politics of America going with them. They were swimming with the current, whereas Palestinians are swimming against the current. They have to deal with this constant power dynamic of not having any say whatsoever, and not having a sovereign, not having any leverage, right? Meanwhile, Israel's moving further and further to the right as we speak. People aged 18 to 24 are 75% likely to support, these far-right groups like religious Zionism, Ben Gvir's Smotrich, all their factions, Netanyahu's center-right faction, etc. That's how it is. That's not how it was in the whole context of slavery and civil rights. There was more of a steady movement with those. There was obviously, that's not a perfect description, but the American white people were generally getting on board, at a steady rate, whereas Israelis are going the other way. So I don't know if a peaceful leader would be heard by the other side. That's the calculation that Palestinians have made after they saw the Oslo peace process fall apart.
So there was an enormous amount of evidence in the case of African Americans in the United States that the likely result of loosening the chains was not going to be a race war. It's just that people ignored that evidence.
But
now,
fine,
when
but
you
let's say it
translate that
was.
to the Israeli-Palestinian
but
conflict,
let's
they
say it
leave
was.
Gaza. They leave Gaza. Two different countries impose a harsh blockade in response to rockets against Israel, and one of those two.
Not really. I mean, as we just said, Egypt is bound by their alliance to Israel. If they don't do the blockade, and I agree with the blockade, by the way. If you're sending rockets over to your neighbor, expect a blockade. Like, this is normal stuff. What's not normal is killing 10,000 people below the age of 10 years old. That's not normal. Blockade is normal, and they could have chilled out like a little bit. You don't have to cut off like the cookies and stuff, but you can surely inspect trade. Like, let them fish. Instead of just 6 miles out into the Mediterranean Sea, maybe 9 miles, right, to catch all their fish, and have an economy that doesn't crash by 90%, or poverty or unemployment rates that aren't completely insufferable. I mean, I agree with the blockade in that it was necessary for the radical people who were in there at the time. Hamas had not yet published their 2017 charter, which mentioned a peace solution by referendum, which is something I talk about a lot.
Gets October 7th and not the other. So one question I have for you is, like, why doesn't Hamas attack Egypt? Why can't they spare a single rocket for Egypt if it's all about...
They don't love Egypt. They just don't hate them as much as they hate Israel. It's a very simple logic there.
Blockade and occupation.
No, I mean, obviously, because their hatred of Israel is on a whole different level. And also, like, yeah, I don't know, like, there's...
So then it's not all about the blockade and the...
No, it's not. No, it's not all. A lot of it's about the creation of the state of Israel. A lot of it's about the fact that they view that as their land, that a lot of them did get kicked out of. Of course, all of this stuff is involved. But anyway, back to your point, though. But, like, so say there was a higher risk. And again, I wasn't saying, I wasn't saying, a lot of times when people make logical analogies, people say, well, that's a bad analogy because the situations aren't the same. But there's a difference between equating two different things and making a logical analogy. The claim isn't that they're the same. But let's say there was going to be a real increase in crime, or let's say there was that some of the black leaders were more radical and were, hold on, let me just finish.
Sure.
And were advocating violence. Is the answer then continue the institution of slavery? I mean, the thing is no, right? It's obviously, and look, the thing about this is with all of this stuff, I just feel like to be a defender of Israel requires you to not be like fair-minded to both groups here. It requires you to think of like, oh, but think about the danger that the Israelis might have to deal with if they were to give these people a state. It's like, yeah, think about the danger that the Palestinians are in being militarily occupied. Like, how are you going to sit here and tell these people that you guys have to embrace nonviolence, your leaders all have to be nonviolent leaders, while the Israeli leaders can be as horrifically violent as they want to? You call Hezbollah a terrorist organization, you call Hamas a terrorist organization. I'm like, fair enough. I don't really object to that categorization. I don't exactly see why the IDF wouldn't also be categorized as a terrorist organization.
So
let's make some clarifications here. Srebrenica was more illegal than the invasion of Iraq by America and, with the help of many other nations, but it was less catastrophic than the invasion of Iraq. And with the help of many other nations, right? It's very important to say this action is morally worse. It has morally worse outcomes because it results in X number of people dying, X suffering, etc. Whereas this is a worse violation of international law. As far as international law goes, October 7th blows anything Israel did in this war out of the water. It is less defensible in international law terms than pretty much anything in the conflict. Right, even 1947. Morally speaking, Israel's offensive has been far worse, probably, than October 7th, because just the sheer amount of people who have died and the regressive nature of the military operation in regards to the peace process. Right, so it's different metrics here. You cannot. It's apples to oranges. Right, You can either go in front of the ICJ or you can ask someone what their opinion is about 60,000 people dying. It's like, the ICJ doesn't rule that way.
But here's the crucial difference. The crucial difference is that Israeli society, as we've discussed in this in this conversation, if they feel they have a partner for peace, are capable of offering, of negotiating in good faith and making an offer because they don't want to serve in the army for the rest of time. They don't want to send their boys to fight these wars. Hamas rejects the...
That's a good point. I always, if someone wants to argue genocide, I would say, why would Israel mobilize 100,000 of their own people? Why do that? Just drop the bombs. If you're doing a genocide, well, why risk anyone if you don't have to? Why put that is the ultimate defense? I think there's tons of other defenses to the genocide claim. Number one being that there's no evidence of it. You need some kind of intelligence, like human intelligence, signal intelligence, etc., to make that assessment. But yeah, why would they put their own children's lives at stake for this thing, just as a thin veil for their true, evil intentions of actual genocide and depopulation of the Gaza Strip?
State solution, period. So,
but we just talked about so does Benjamin Netanyahu.
But Israel is a democracy, and they will vote Netanyahu out of power if they feel that the other side is capable and interested.
But they've made him their longest-serving prime minister in their country's history. So, they're not voting him out of power that much.
Hold on. This happened, as you yourself admitted, not even reluctantly. I don't mean to phrase it that way. The Second Intifada, Israel offered a two-state end of conflict, period. It was rejected by the Palestinians, and then the Second Intifada was launched. This was, mothers sending their kids on 2 different buses to schools because a bus was getting blown up every 3 days, right? Which was traumatizing for a country the size of New Jersey. I can't imagine how I would react having grown up in New Jersey if there was 2 bombs going off a week just in my state alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would demand of my government to absolutely do what it had to do to make us.
And that's why I justify the blockade. If you think that the blockade, it was this massive atrocity anywhere near the level of what the current Gaza war is, then you have not looked into the wrongdoings of Palestinians in this conflict, of which there are many. And if you cannot talk about them for a long time, then you haven't been fair, right? If you can only talk about the Israeli wrongdoings, of which mostly recent and at the beginning, of course. Now in the middle, there's a lot of, smaller, less catastrophic in terms of lives lost, Palestinian violence.
Not only that, the fact that this came right after an offer of peace and what Shlomo Ben Ami called the biggest effort ever to pressure an international leader on any issue to end this conflict, because the world, my God, we have to see this conflict end at some point. It's so heartbreaking. The problem with this is that Israeli society can move because it's a democracy. Hamas can't move. Hamas is absolutely committed to rejecting the only solution that could bring an end to this conflict. And so Hamas is like a rock, whereas Israel, object as much as you want to Netanyahu. I'm not going to defend him. I'm not going to defend Smotrich. I'm not going to defend Ben-Gvir. Israel is a democracy that can move to the left if the opportunity came.
Read the charter. I mean, it says that the 2017 charter says their peace solution is a product of a national consensus. They are at the whims of the Palestinian people. They will not subvert those wishes, right? If they claim to be the leaders of the Palestinians, which they do claim to be, they're not some ISIS figure that wants to dissolve all these boundaries and create one massive global caliphate, right? They're kind of nationalists. They're nationalist leaders. They supposedly care about their people. What they say is that they, especially recently, we have no reason to believe that they wouldn't support a two-state solution. Now, they would be less kind to maybe give up some sovereignty over the Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, as I think is reasonable, because those neighborhoods were actually ethnically cleansed by Jordan. And so those Jews there have right of return to East Jerusalem, of course, and I support their right of return just as I support the Palestinians' right of return.
Peace treaty that will be inked for all time. How the hell do we get that with Hamas running the Gaza Strip when every single time they are asked, they say, we we reject any alternative for all time, except between the river and the sea.
Yeah, there actually have been different periods of time where Hamas leaders have said they would accept 67 borders, but they have also a lot of times said they wouldn't, and so
including over and over and over again recently, and in their charter.
Yeah, I'm not even like arguing with you on that detail.
I will argue on it because the Hamas politics, they are right. Hamas politics is one against the two-state solution, but they said that their politics should not subvert the national will of the Palestinian people. This is something that I think they can probably hold themselves to. And if they can't, then prove me wrong. Maybe I'm putting too much faith in Hamas. Maybe I'm trusting them. I think it's in their best interest, of course, to serve their people. Their people are already turning against them. They're a fragile regime, far more fragile than the Ayatollah or like name many other regimes. They're probably not that secure. But are they the best peace negotiator? No. You want to still negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. I absolutely agree with that. But they are still able to be negotiated with because they made it very clear they will lay down arms if the 1967 borders is used as a template. Now, if they are hardlined, 1967 borders are nothing, including East Jerusalem, then that is a different question. But I believe that they are more so using it as a template, as all the questions in the polls ask it, as like along the 1967 borders, to a true Palestinian sovereignty. But he's not wrong. He's not wrong.
It's always like when you say like Hamas. First of all, I actually disagree with fundamentally with your premise that democracies like have this ability to move. I think actually one of the kind of counterintuitive, strange realities is that often democracies get very stuck. And for example, like the political system in the United States of America really has not like fundamentally changed nearly as much as the political system in China has over, say, like the last 40 years. And they did it through a one-party dictatorship. They still call themselves because the one party says business is good now, and then all of a sudden it's a drastically different thing than it was before. But regardless of that, yeah, but like you can say there's a lot of things Hamas could do that would be a lot better than the things that Hamas has done and could do now that would be better than the things they're doing. Israel also can end the war. It's not true that only one side could do the things that would end the war. I don't even know if you can call it a war. But Israel
could end this war. But Hamas is just going to restart the war.
It's not even really a war, man. Like a war, you kind of think of as like two governments with militaries battling. It's a captive
Hamas has
people.
What, 20,000, 30,000 people? That's not a war? Hamas has 30,000 fighters or whatever it is?
Yeah, no, it's a captive people who have been held stateless without a military of their own being like annihilated. I mean, like, yeah, I don't think war is...
Hamas doesn't have very good military technology. That's why the rockets they've sent over into Israel are so easily shot down. Their military is very weak. So I think it's October 7th was it should have never happened. It should have, because the Israeli security should have been good enough to stop it. I mean, it was not an expensive terrorist attack. Not too sophisticated if you think about it. If you look at the plans for October 7th.
The right word. But regardless of that, Israel also has the opportunity. Israel could simply say, we're going to stop militarily occupying the West Bank. We're going to pull those, and we're going to live in 67 borders. And you do what you want to do, but if you attack us, we're responding. They could do that too, and they have not done that.
Yeah,
but
well,
I do just
hold on.
again.
So,
hold on.
again,
Let me just get a points out here because I'm listening to what you have to say. Again, I find this to be like kind of fascinating. Every time I debate or have a discussion like this about the topic, I'm just always struck by the fact that you have like, we're halfway around the world. There is a long-standing conflict that's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But yet, when you talk about this again, and which, by the way, I'm with you on, I think we should think about, like, what would it be like to live in a state the size of New Jersey where there's school buses being blown up every day. Listen, I live in the state of New Jersey and I have little kids. Like, when you say that, I'm listening and I'm like genuinely trying to put myself in that position. And by the way, I am not saying I'm like a very good person. I think I would go to a pretty bad place pretty quickly if I thought one of my kids were threatened. However, in this conflict, Gaza is a substantially smaller place than Israel and has way more bombings going.
Yeah, talk about the death toll. I haven't heard anything about the death toll. Usually I'm tired of hearing about the death toll, but Coleman Hughes hasn't talked about it because I want to hear him justify it. This is the only thing we're talking about at this point in the conversation. Anyone who's looked at this conflict in fairness will say the Israelis have done some bad stuff, Palestinians have done some bad stuff. Everything changed after the Swords of Iron, and after the military operation that followed October 7th. Everything changed. Not everything. That was a lie. The settlements leading up to that were, of course, a huge deal. But even settler violence really only took off 2022 to 2023. So it's fairly recent that Israel has really become this like despicable, right wing sort of political body. Like that's what it's become.
Way more innocent people being killed. And so I just always find it interesting that, like, okay, we're going to put ourselves in the Israeli shoes. Like, okay, I'm fine to do that. Let's do that. Could we also attempt to do that to the other side here? Like,
Easily. I'll do it right now. I'll do it right now. Hold on. I'll do it right now.
Thousandfold
I'll do it
worse.
right now, Dave. This is the point I tried to make before, but I don't think I made it precisely enough. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of Palestinians for a moment. Now, we know from the history of the 20th century, whether it is the partition of India and Pakistan or the partition of Sudan and South Sudan more recently, that when you have a situation like this, a gruesome situation where two peoples can't get along and there's slaughtering on both sides, it seems like pretty much the best formula we have is something like a partition along roughly ethnic lines. It's not a perfect solution by any means, but Sudan and South Sudan are fighting with each other as states a lot less than they did when it was one state for 50 years of brutal civil war. So, if I'm a Palestinian in Gaza right now, purely looking from my own perspective, sure, I would absolutely want Israel to end the war, to alleviate my immediate suffering. But I would also like to think that I would understand the regime that rules Gaza right now is committed to a forever war against Israel, which means if Israel withdraws, ends the war right now, leaves Hamas in power, Gaza is again on borrowed time until the next time that Hamas is able to find a crack in the armor, which always happens. And so, in addition to wanting Israel to end the war, I would really want to see some massive international effort to get rid of Hamas. And I don't know how you do that because Hamas embeds itself in the civilian population and uses them as a shield. But I would understand, just purely from the point of view of me wanting, I'd love to live in a situation like,
That's great. If you could push the get rid of Hamas button, then you should push it. I'm sure Coleman Hughes has it on his desk right there. That's not the reality of the situation, right? You've admitted that this task is impossible, right? If Hamas or some version of Hamas is probably going to become relevant, if Israel doesn't give up, if they keep going in their right-wing path, say there shall never be Palestinian sovereignty, the very recent Knesset votes, right? If Israel keeps going down that path, yes, something like that will happen. There will be a chink in the armor, and there will be another October 7th. Your answer to that is not to kill like 60,000 more people. Your answer to that is to follow the guidelines of international law, make a constant outstanding peace offer, and wait until a Palestinian authority or the Palestinian Authority or a Palestinian figure like MLK, Gandhi, whatever, accepts it. That is your solution. And if you do that, then nobody will be against Israel. There will never be any more Israel-Palestine debates. Everyone will be on Israel's side because they have the outstanding peace offer and it is a good deal by anyone's standards. If that is the case, then you have a point.
South Sudan and Sudan. We don't have to love each other, but we're not at each other's throats. We could be like, we could be a frozen conflict like North and South Korea. We can hate each other. The only way you get to a frozen conflict is with a ruling entity in Gaza that could actually agree to a frozen conflict because it's what they want. So how do you get that without getting rid of Hamas? And this is from the Palestinian perspective.
Yeah, I guess it kind of is. I don't really think it's a very reasonable way to look at it from the Palestinian perspective.
Why am I looking at videos of Palestinians protesting Hamas?
Okay,
what's their point of view?
Yeah, Palestinian support for October 7th has fallen dramatically. They would not want another October 7th. It really comes down to how you portray Hamas. Because if you think Hamas is ISIS, then you have a stronger argument. My problem is I don't think Hamas is ISIS. I think that they have forked over some of their ideology to stay politically relevant among the Palestinian populace who voted them in on a plurality. That I think that's what we have here, because yes, after October 7th, some of them said crazy stuff. Fadi Hamad in 2019 said, the Palestinian diaspora should rise up and kill every Jew. And then the other other Hamas bodies came and said that's not our position. 2017 charter says we don't have problems with Jews. There's mixed signals all over the place. I get that. But how do we know if Israel never even offered them anything? Like, how do we know? At least offer them what was offered in 2008, and at least offer them, UN Resolution 194, which is historically unassailable. If you've studied 1947, at least offer them that in principle. Like, you don't have to do a full right of return. Just like in principle, acknowledge that you are responsible for the suffering, and I think that would do a lot to alleviate the non-material animosity between both sides.
Is exactly what I just said.
There were some videos of people protesting Hamas. There's been some protests of the Israeli government in Israel too. One could argue not.
Support for October 7th is down. Support for October 7th is down. It's down to 30%. It was up in the West Bank. It was like 80%. Now it's down to 50%. Gaza, it was up at like 76%. Now it's 71%. Now it's down to like 30-something%. So that dynamic is real.
Enough on both sides or whatever, but I think that if your story was okay, and keep in mind with these things that often when people talk about war, people talk about the conflict like this side started it, this side was guilty, this side did it, when really what's going on is that there are people in positions of power who are making decisions, and then there's a whole bunch of innocent people just caught up in the situation. The entire project of Israel, the entire project of a bunch of Eastern Europeans deciding that they wanted to go create a state in land where Arabs were already living, when it came into fruition, resulted in hundreds of thousands of them being expelled from where they were living or not allowed to return. After the 6-Day War, they were occupied.
I don't think that's an intellectually honest way of describing the birth of Israel.
I think
you can say Dave Smith's description of 1967 I think is dishonest. 1947 I think it's pretty unassailable, as I just said, but maybe he'll jump into that. Like, we know exactly how many villages were leveled, exactly how many of these localities were told to leave by either Haganah forces or terrorist forces like the Lehi and the Irgun. We know all this stuff, right?
Actually correct. Way of describing
it's very easy to paint a dishonest picture by leaving out a lot of facts.
Okay.
This is why we have the phrase lie of omission.
Sure, but I wasn't claiming to have been telling the totality of everything that ever happened there.
No. But crucial facts, like a bunch of Eastern Europeans deciding to go to Palestine. That framing ignores the fact that Eastern European refugees, basically their plan A was all, and I think you know this, to flood into New York and Canada and other places and escape the pogroms and the slaughtering of the Russian Civil War and do what any human being...
Yeah, they had no choice. I agree with that. Now the pogroms could be an outgrowth of Zionism, which was an outgrowth of maybe not that option being less so. Maybe it's an outgrowth of like religious Zionism, wanting to get back this land, like Ben Gvir. I mean, not Ben Gurion, right?
Do and get the hell away from the violence against your family. Then the entire West closes doors. America closes doors essentially in 1921, 24. Canada closes doors. Australia closes doors. Latin America closes doors. And only then do you see Eastern European Jews saying, okay, this place, Palestine, I guess we can't get into New York. I guess we'll start going there. I mean, it was trickles before that happened. And so it was a refugee state. They weren't ideological Zionists for the most part. And I don't think anyone could go back without 2020 hindsight and tell them that they shouldn't have gone there. So I think that's very important context. And it's also important context if you just start this.
There's also the colonial pretense of that. Who was controlling the immigration policy, right? These people weren't a sovereign. They were a colonial. They were in a colonial mandate, right? Balfour made that declaration. Maybe it didn't pick up. There's multiple waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine. It certainly picked up by the end. I don't know that it was trickles when Balfour made his declaration. Relatively, it was. That's all very relevant what he's saying right there. They had no choice, which is why I would consider myself a Zionist in a society where Zionism means the idea that there is some reasonability to a Jewish state in the context of the Holocaust. I'll make that argument, but that's not what that word seems to mean right now.
Story at the ending and say, and as you did, as the end result, 750,000 Palestinians were pushed out. Well, what happened? Palestinians started a civil war in Mandate Palestine, and then 5 Arab countries all at once invaded Israel in a war of aggression.
I don't buy that. For 1967, he has a point for poor framing on the Palestinian side, but that is poor framing on his part. Why did they start the civil war? Because they were not a sovereign to begin with, as I just mentioned. All of these people who were openly talking about transfer, right? Transfer, albeit in the context of the Holocaust, but they were still scared of having a Jewish state, living as a minority in a Jewish state, and being expelled from a Jewish state. They were legitimately fearful of that. They saw all these Arab countries get their mandates turned into states, except them. They have to now split up their land. So they do a civil war because they had no seat at the table as to how this land should be split up, right? That is a natural reaction. And it's a reaction that I cannot blame really anyone for. It is what happens after that, much similar to 1967, that is the problem. It's not the problem that Israel fought that civil war. It's not the problem that they fought their war in 1948, except for what happened after, and that is that they did not return people to their homes. And they explicitly told people to leave their homes in drastic numbers. And there was a massive terrorist presence among the Zionist forces. They did not seem to care much for international law. There are at least 800 deaths from documented massacres, like that of October 7th, like hatred-filled massacres, right? It's not just a war of defense. And once you fight your war of defense, you have to say, we're going to have our state. We're going to defend ourselves, but we're not going to create a refugee crisis. So if you want to come back, we're going to allow you back. And it's going to be a Jewish majority state still, but it's going to be what the 47 partition plan, resolution 181 laid out. And it's going to be a smaller majority. We're not going to have our 70-30 majority. We're going to have a 55-45 majority, right? That is the moral way to go about it. Not keeping this refugee crisis going on forever and imposing this upon people, stealing their land, literally stealing their property, all their wealth. It's impoverished a whole class of people.
Those decisions didn't need to be made. They're pretty relevant context. You don't really understand the last scene of the movie without the first. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I guess again, it's all just irrelevant to the point that I was trying to make. And again, you're back to just harping on the perspective of the Jews and then the Zionists and then the Israelis. The point I was making is that there's another perspective here too. And all of that is true, essentially what you said. I mean, not exactly. I mean, like the King Crane Commission also pretty accurately predicted what the future of this struggle was going to look like when they were looking at it in 1919 or whatever year it was, the 1920, when they went over there. They went, man, you're going to try to create a Jewish state here. This is just going to be permanent struggle. It's going to require.
Yeah, Zionism was seen as extreme until the Biltmore Conference. Really, I think that's when things really ramped up, and they got their pretense for the UN. Once Britain put the ball in the court of the UN to make this Israel thing happen. That's when things really heated up. Like, this could actually be a possibility. Before that, it was pretty extreme. But Dave Smith is kind of cherry picking here, though.
Permanent force, because this is just something that, obviously the people who live here are going to resist. I'm saying from the perspective of the Palestinian person who didn't start that war or didn't do that and just happened to be one of the people caught up in there and got kicked out of their land. Then you're occupied for 60 years. The Israeli project, I'm not saying this is the entirety of everything. Yes, there are things being omitted here, just like every time both of us speak, we're not telling the entire story of all of history. The experiment of Israel, the experiment of Europeans trying to create a Jewish state on land where Arabs lived, that is what they did. There might have been reasons for that, but that's what ended up happening. The result of that was 750 Arabs being expelled from where they lived.
Yes, and people like Benny Morris, and to an extent myself, will justify that in the context of the Holocaust. But after that happens, you should be indebted to those people. Those people by displacing them, you are able to protect yourself. So you should offer them some kind of legitimate compensation, legitimate right of return. If them returning doesn't sacrifice any of your security, which they could easily do today, right? They have a large majority there. They could easily maintain a quota of 2 Jews per one Arab and incorporate a ton of people, completely satisfy full right of return, have their Jewish state, but they don't do it. Because there is an element of religious convictions. We want Judea and Samaria. That's all relevant too.
And not allowed back in. They're for the period between 1948 and 1967. They're living as refugees in different places. Then from 1967 all the way up till today, they're militarily.
And Palestinians in that period, 1948 to 1967, weren't even subject to civil law. They were under military law. That did change, but it's just an interesting fact.
Occupied by a foreign power, and now it's culminating in what scholars will debate whether it's a genocide or not, okay? Or whatever the hell you want to call this. I don't want to get caught up in semantics here. All of that happened too. And then after all of that, you sit here, Coleman, and you go, why are they attacking Israel and not Egypt? It's because there's a long history here, man. And they're really pissed off about this.
Hold on. And I think this is it's worth actually dwelling on this, because what you didn't emphasize in your story is that Egypt obviously occupied Gaza for 19 years.
And Jordan occupied the West Bank for 19 years. Yep, that's true.
Did not give them a state.
That's true.
Could have given them a state, did not. And Egypt has every single bit of harsh blockade since 2007. Egypt copy-paste.
Again, we have the aid we have to consider. Their aid would be gone if they somehow, all their allies would be gone. Egypt would never betray Israel in that blockade. That is Israel's blockade that Egypt is helping enforce. That is the reality of the situation. As far as the occupation of the West Bank by Jordan, Gaza by Egypt, yes, Jordan did want to kind of use the West Bank as their own, greater Jordan project. Kind of abused the Palestinians, and that later the PLO had to move to Lebanon because the Jordanians and the Palestinians had a real falling out. Palestinians don't like Jordan, and they didn't like Egypt. That like there was a falling out there. Arabs aren't innocent. Like anyone's make the argument that the Arabs are like the Dalai Lama in this story is like they don't know the facts. So we're arguing about the current death toll. That is what matters.
Absolutely. In fact, worse, because when they discovered smuggling tunnels underneath the Gaza border, they pumped them with poison gas and sewage and killed Palestinians as a result. Now, if Israel had done that, that would be exhibits A through Z on why Hamas is fighting Israel for legitimate, understandable reasons. And yet, Egypt does.
No, these tunnels that we know are built by Hamas, because they can only be built by Hamas because Hamas has the resources to build them. Palestinians cannot build these tunnels on their own, obviously. That would be a legitimate military target. And if you have a little bit of collateral damage, that can be justified. The level now collateral damage when you have a massive war, even if it's relatively lenient relatively compliant with international law, it does get to a point where it's like your war better be very worth it. So that's where the collateral damage argument fails. But if it's just this terror tunnel that is being used to smuggle arms in to fund this actual terrorist organization, then you can assume that pumping gas into that is probably gonna be a good decision. Like this, no one would complain about that. It would not be on any exhibit A through Z. Israel's done far worse stuff. Just even the mildest part of the blockade was probably worse than that. Like limiting how far Gazans could go out to fish, destroying the fishing industry by 90%. That is much, much worse than pumping an actual terrorist tunnel full of gas in order to stop it from smuggling. Very basic.
All of that, and Hamas can't spare a single rocket. And this is practically a science experiment for understanding what Hamas actually cares about. I think you're very quick to see pretenses in American foreign policy and very slow to see them in other groups around the world.
No, I don't think so, man. I'm not.
But
I
again,
don't
this
think
is practically
so.
a science experiment. It's practically a science experiment to see actually what does Hamas care about. It is entirely about the humiliation of having a Jewish state on that land, not about the occupation, not about not having.
Nothing is entirely about anything. Like that's omitting details. Hamas changes. They have changed. From 1988, when their charter was written by some like angered old man in the first Intifada, to their 2017 charter, to their recent developments, they have changed undeniably. Saying Hamas is not going to get you anywhere because Hamas can change, and there's a reason why I think that it's not worth fighting a war of annihilation against Hamas. Is because I don't think Hamas is ISIS, and if Hamas was ISIS, then I would have a very different way of destroying them than what Israel's doing right now. That way would be let every single innocent person who is not part of this ISIS-Hamas figure that I made up into Israel proper, drain Gaza of the innocents, then kill or capture the people who are in there that are guilty in your estimation, or fight a war with them. Now, once you have those Palestinians in your state, that because you're fighting the war, you take them in, right? This is your war. Take them in for a while, fight the war. You can let them go, because then no one's going to blame you for ethnic cleansing, because guess what? That they claim that that's their land too, or at least it should have been if they had a single Palestinian state. Israel has an incentive to move them back to Gaza, so all of it kind of aligns. Israel just doesn't want to have that many Arabs in their boundaries for some reason. But if they were to be in that position to fight an actual war of annihilation, that is how they would do it. And it would dramatically decrease deaths, and that would be a very moral war.
Country. For them, it's not about the settlements in the West Bank. For them, Tel Aviv is the same as a settlement in the West Bank. It's all one phenomenon of a Jewish state that needs to be expired from the river to the sea.
Well, look, I mean, I think, again, it's not when you say that, I could see, this is what I think is kind of bizarre about this, right? Is that you'll say, you could see all the corruption in like the American war party or the Israeli war party or something like that, but you can't see obviously here with Hamas too. But that's just not right. I'm not sitting here defending Hamas. Hamas has just been horrible. They're like a death cult.
I didn't say corruption. I said false pretense. It's a
sure,
different argument.
the false pretense, whatever you want to,
So
whatever.
you agree it's a false, Hamas's concern about blockade and occupation and not having you agree this is a false pretense and that is actually about the humiliation of a Jewish state on
I think that we are so...
No, because I think you are omitting the fact that they are a paper tiger of a regime within their own boundaries. They have to respond to their people. They do PR for like, how they treat hostages, partly to, decrease their own internal dissatisfaction, which has risen dramatically. Now, I'm not an expert on why it's risen dramatically. I think a lot of it's due to October 7th. I don't think a lot of it's due to the hostages. I think Palestinians probably couldn't care less about the hostages because, 20 people being held hostage versus 60,000 people dying. Like, they're probably preoccupied with other stuff, and I don't blame them for that. You have to be able to have that sympathy there.
Many decades into this thing that it's devolved to the tragic level where Hamas is basically a death cult. And yeah, it's a grudge. They're trying to get back at the Israelis any way they can for the most part. Yeah, that's like, yes, essentially, like, I do think that's right. And I also would say that, like, what I think everybody should kind of accept here, in the same way that, like, we're not giving the land back to the Native Americans, man. And like, it's horrible the way states rise to be. I mean, I'm a radical libertarian. My fundamental view is essentially that states are gangs who took over and are in some sense perceived as legitimate, but that's essentially what they are. The rule.
Yep. Dave Smith is only good for Israel-Palestine within limit. Everything else he's kind of stupid. So states are demonstrably good. If not, we'd be constantly fighting civil wars, constantly be having trade disputes, constantly be having currency disputes, have no financial system, no trade. I mean, there's just a host of, no democracy. We'd all be having private militias to enforce the private court system. It's just the stupidity of libertarianism. Libertarianism has some decent ideas for foreign policy, but they're also kind of garbage there too.
In a geographic territory. And so, yeah, lots of them are created in real messy, immoral circumstances. But generations later, you'd be doing the same thing over to a whole new group of innocent people if you were to kick all the Israelis out of Israel and make it from the river to the sea all Palestinian or something like that. I think that's why almost every adult in the room, when there's been real negotiations or when there's been real talks of ever getting close to a peace process, have always started talking about 67 borders, right? But so the dynamic is this. I essentially think as horrible as the Nakba was, and as horrible as the 1948 war was, and as horrible as all of that is, yeah, I do think that eventually people can get over that and move on. It's very, very painful.
Well,
I think the timeline of getting over it was 1978 with Camp David. Before that, I wouldn't be comfortable telling people to get over it. After it, yeah, get over it. For the sake of, you will never completely agree with this people, so if you don't get over it, utility in the long run is probably going to be lost there.
But everyone else in an analogous situation from the 1940s has moved on.
Yeah, but the other factor there, Coleman, is that they occupied them militarily for 60 years, the longest military occupation in the world.
We have to talk about the 67 world. Why did that happen? Israel did not choose that war. I mean, I know you have this Begin quote, but saying that Israel chose or you're not exactly saying this, but saying that because Egypt fired first, that therefore Israel caused the 67 war is
nothing is that simple. His explanation, they're both wrong about this. The 67 war was clearly started by Nasser intentionally, but it was the framework for it was laid out by Israel. What do I mean by that? I already explained this, I think. They had a red line of the Straits of Tiran. Nasser knew 100% it would cause a war. There's so much documentation of this. He knew that would cause a war. His initial deployment of troops was based on a false Soviet intelligence that Israel was mounting troops on to go invade Syria due to water diversion, and he sent one of his aides to check out what was happening with that, and he said that's BS. And he had all of his aides like begging him to go to war with Israel, and the amount of people he sent was irrelevant, not irrelevant. It was insignificant to actually fight a war. There's tons of things you have to think about here. But at the end of the day, he did cross Israel's reasonable red line, which is don't block Eilat. We get 90% of our oil from that. That rhymed. If you do, we will go to war with you. And they weren't clamoring for the West Bank either. They said, "Hey Jordan, we won't attack you if you don't attack us." That was the exact quote.
Intellectually dishonest, as saying that because Mexico fired first, Mexico caused the Mexican.
I will add, so I don't sound like I agree with Coleman. Everything bad that happened with that conflict happened after the conflict, much like 1948, 1947. It was what happened after the conflict, not the conflict itself. The conflict itself was relatively justifiable.
War. Now, we all know that America wanted that war, that we put our troops in that territory that was contested and Texas said was theirs. Specifically, Ulysses S. Grant said exactly the plan was to get them to fire, and it was essential that they fire first, but we all know what the plan was. We wanted terror.
That's also stupid. Polk sent troops into a territory that was not his. Egypt never did that. They militarized the Sinai, asked the UN peacekeeping force to leave. They have a legitimate claim to the Sinai. Apples to oranges.
Okay? So you have everyone in the room from the Egyptian side, from the Jordanian side, saying that Nasser knew if he closed the Strait of Tiran that it was war. This is from Sadat's memoir. From Sadat, who was in the room, his memoir. He goes,
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah, Nasser convened a meeting, the Supreme Executive Council. He said, now with our troops in the Sinai, the chances of war are 50-50. But if we close the strait, war will be a 100% certainty. Then he...
I will say, I don't think Nasser wanted war. Like, if you look, he was actually intending on doing a ceasefire. If war was the outcome, he didn't want to necessarily fight a war of annihilation. He was more so doing the Straits of Tiran to show Arab resolve. He had kind of been weak in the past decade. He had allowed this UN peacekeeping force to, occupy the Sinai. He asked them to leave. He had been allowing Israel to use Tehran, right, after the Suez crisis. That had all made him seem weak. And also his failed coalition with Syria, etc. He was stupid. He was a stupid leader.
His general, are the forces ready? Okay, and the King Hussein said he knew the same thing. So this was Israel was freaking out about this war. They didn't want this war. And on top of that, they gave Jordan every opportunity not to join in and even let them fire for a little bit, hoping that they would make a show of attacking from the West Bank and then save their pride. And so that's how the West Bank came under Israeli occupation. And then immediately, Israelis proposed going into negotiations for land for peace. And what do the Arab countries do? The three no's of Khartoum.
Land for peace never included the Sinai, never included the West Bank. Again, you're talking about irrelevant pieces of land. The Sinai is not relevant, right? That's what land for peace was for. If you want to talk about peace, talk about the peace overtures that Sadat sent Israel that were ignored, saying essentially, we're gonna open the Suez Canal if you essentially give us this land on the other side of the canal. It was a starter land agreement for future negotiations down the road. And every historian would say that was a major mistake. Israel should have taken that, because not taking that left Sadat with no choice but to do the Yom Kippur War.
Peace, no negotiation, no recognition.
Yeah,
so again,
that's all right.
That's okay. So then, how that is very important context for, first of all, how the occupation came to be. It was not by Israeli design. Israelis didn't want it. I mean, some religious minorities wanted it, but
Yeah, but the difference here, Coleman, is that like, yeah, I can gladly concede all of that.
Oh,
I mean,
and then
there were all
can I
types of
address
Arab
myself to
leaders.
your point
It's tragic.
earlier?
It's tragic how much this was all mishandled and what a devastation it was. And obviously, in hindsight, what a horrific decision for the Egyptians to begin provoking that war. I agree.
Yeah. So, but you said earlier, basically, like you don't get to occupy people for this many years, and I get that. I get that. And my point is that, as I said earlier, Olmert ran on a campaign of withdrawing from the West Bank out of this this exact impulse, this sense that we've got to give it a try, right? We've given, and he won. And then what undermined his ultimate plan to withdraw from the West Bank was the fact that right after he's elected, two things happened. There's a cross-border raid from Gaza, and Gilad Shalit gets taken and some other people get killed. And then there's a cross-border raid from Lebanon, where the Israelis had pulled out unilaterally just a few years ago. So what happened is that they have...
Again, you're talking about irrelevant pieces of land. Notice the consistency here. Make the analogy to slavery, civil rights, whatever you want. That's all very useful. Like these actions of this group doesn't make them unable to govern themselves ever in the future. And these actions are highly tied to the occupied territories. If they were to be decoupled from the occupied territories through a legitimate peace proposal that followed every single UN recommendation, then I would have no complaints. I would be 100% against the Arabs' actions here.
Twin example of a place that we've occupied and a place that we've pulled out of, and we just got attacked from both of the places that we unilaterally pulled out of. Now, can you understand how an Israeli voter would say, okay, I was for the idea of pulling out of the West Bank. It kind of made sense to me, and just battening down the hatches, trying to play perfect defense. And then we pulled out of Gaza and we pulled out of Lebanon, and instantly we get, not instantly, but in the same year, we get cross-border raids, we get rockets, and we have to go into bomb shelters. I don't think this unilateral withdrawal strategy works. I think we have to have a peace deal and withdraw only in that.
You've never tried it. Apply this to Russia, Ukraine, or something. Like what are you talking about? If Putin wants this much of the Donbass versus this much of the Donbass, and he gives up 20%, and the Ukrainians still fighting, he's like, oh, I don't think this giving up land thing to the Ukrainians works. It's like, well, you haven't given up all of it, and giving up all of it is part of recognizing a sovereign territory that isn't yours under international law. That's very important.
Next. Can you can sympathize with an Israeli voter with a family living who wants peace but says, I'm not going to sign on to peace unless it's going to be a real peace?
Yeah, I can sympathize with them, but again, it's the only one side who you ever make an attempt to sympathize with.
No, I already gave you a whole answer about what I would think if I was a Palestinian.
But it's kind of nonsense. It's like, yeah, but when you're
how is it
sympathizing,
nonsense?
because when you're sympathizing with the Palestinians, you go, oh man, I think if I were a Palestinian, I would really feel like my government really should do a better job, or my government, that Hamas should really do a better job, instead of just going like,
no,
look,
I would be for a partition on either side. If I was, I have little kids. If someone had the value of life over my little,
I'm glad he would argue for partition on either side. Then he seems like he would agree with me. Then the kind of partition that I would offer is different. We haven't talked about the death toll. We haven't talked about right of return. These are the two biggest roadblocks. One of them's more obvious than the other in the current conflict. And none of them seem to have touched upon that. And that is part of partition. You cannot say partition and just leave it at that. That should never be accepted, because partition can be very unfair if done poorly. And it should also include, basic recognition of 194, at least settlement within Gaza West Bank, at least international control over, Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, above ground and below ground. It should at least have all of that. International security on the Jordanian border. That is all very, very important. And most of all, something that we can't sympathize as Westerners is the ability for Palestinians to say this conflict is over, not because we got some material concession, but because we got a more symbolic concession that allows us to have more peace of mind. That is a bigger part than most people like to think it is. Gideon Levy talks about it a lot. It's about humiliation. If it was all about materials resources, land, 97% land versus 99% land, then this conflict would be over. But it's not about that. That's not what makes 70-year conflicts. It's deep-seated mistrust, deep-seated non-material issues with the other side. And both sides need to make serious concessions, probably, mostly Israel. They have to pull out hundreds of thousands of people here. Palestinians need to make concessions that they're not going to be able to live all in their Palestinian majority one state to the extent that they want that. And they might have to deal with an ethnicity cap as far as how many of them can actually return to Israel, even under my proposed solution, which would be a 2/3 majority cap, 66.6667% Israelis, and the other percentage, 33.3, could be non-Israelis, and you can do right of return based on that cap, and it should be more than enough based on what I've calculated to end the conflict. And of course, most of them don't even want to go back to that area anyways. So saying you agree with partitions, that's why I can see from the Palestinian perspective. No, you can't, because your idea of a partition is not incorporating what is necessarily a part of the Palestinian perspective, as is shown demonstrably for why this conflict has gone on for as long as it has. But I'm losing my voice.